In this video, I'm going to describe the complete disassembly of this transmission. And then when I'm done with that, you're going to want to watch the assembly video where I cover the clutch pack clearances and gear set components, and also watch the valve body video where I go through the valve body completely, explain how everything works in there, and also explain some modifications that are done in this valve body assembly. So here we are at our AL90 on the bench. We're going to overhaul this transmission, take it completely apart. We're going to study the gear set, study the clutches, study the valve body, kind of go through things. We're even going to go through and look at a couple modifications that are done with a TransGo kit and some Sonnax modifications. More specifically, there's zip kits that they install in this transmission. So let's do a quick walk around on this transmission to see what we're up against. This is where the torque converter is going to live, the input shaft, stator support shaft. Look at this, they've got the little seal retaining. Kind of took a page out of the book of the 4L60 there to kind of keep the seals from popping out. This always makes me nervous when I see these dowel pins still in the transmission, because if they swap this out, hopefully they have locating dowel pins for that new transmission. On this side, we see here's the thermostatic bypass for the oil cooler. A lot of shops will modify this so that way they can keep the transmission temps nice and cool. This unit here is four-wheel drive. This is where the transfer case would bolt up to. Here's the output shaft. There's our pass-through connector. There's our identification tag. We'll look a little closer at that, see what that means. And we have a vent. Nothing too exciting. So I'm going to start just by taking the oil pan off. Now I already took this transmission apart just to kind of clean it up. And this did have a decent amount of metal on the magnets. I didn't really spend much time cleaning the magnets off. I figured I'd leave the metal on the magnets so that way when students take this apart, they would realize that there was a failure in this transmission. Now that I got the pan off and I got the filter out of the way, let's go through and identify a few of the things that we're looking at here. These are the solenoids that we have in this transmission. When I pop this piece off, you'll see that they're actually labeled on the valve body, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and H. There's a couple solenoids here, a couple on-off. Most of these are pulse width modulated, and they're going to be responsible for the shift quality or the shift feel that we've got in this transmission. This is an off-axis oil pump, and that's what this, the chain drive is located behind this little pinkish cover, and this is the oil pump itself. We've got a range sensor right here, kind of built into the rooster comb, kind of held in place by the spring. Back here towards the end, we've got this, what they call a pulse accumulator, and that's for our start-stop vehicles. So that way, when the engine shuts off, the pressure that they have built up in here, they'll open the solenoid up and it can just slowly kind of pre-charge or keep these fluid circuits filled, at least, not necessarily under pressure, but at least filled up, so the point where when the engine does start, it just builds pressure. It doesn't have to fill any volumes of clutches or anything like that. So this won't be found on every vehicle. It's just on the start-stop equipped vehicles. So the first thing I'm going to do is go through and release this main connector here. That just lifts up so that way we can pull kind of our main harness out of this little sub-harness. Then I'm going to go through and disconnect all my solenoids and my range sensor, and then we'll get this plastic piece out of the way. Then we got these little tabs. They get this plastic piece to kind of unlock from the valve body. So you give that a little squeeze and lift up at the same time, and the plastic piece will lift up and out of the way. Lastly, we got this little Christmas tree that we got to pull out of the valve body, and that allows us to get our harness off and out of the way. So this harness is kind of the source of some issues in this transmission. They've made an updated harness, and I think there's a campaign or a recall or something, or at least a service bulletin that relates to it. So if this is something that you've changed in the past, that you can get reimbursed for that if you've kept the receipts, and you might contact your customers and let them know that's something that they can get reimbursed for. But a lot of it's due to the sensor. That's a temp sensor right there. And that temp sensor, when it fails, it causes DTCs and causes your transmission to not operate properly. Now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to take the oil pump kind of chain guard off here, and then we're actually going to take the sprocket and the chain away from the oil pump. The oil pump is built into the valve body, or at least half of it is. So in order to get the valve body off, we need to kind of unhook it. Now you can take all the bolts out and you can kind of fish it off sideways. It does work that way. But they actually make a provision in the pump sprocket to allow you to slide the pump sprocket off so you can pull the valve body straight up and out of the way. So in order to get this off, there are a couple aluminum bolts that hold this cover down. Those aluminum bolts are things that are supposed to be replaced, and a lot of kits will have those already in there, so you don't have to purchase them separately. But they utilize an inverted Torx Plus. It's the EP10. So we will use those to get these aluminum bolts off, but also we'll use that EP10 to go through and take the kind of the inverted Torx that we have on the valve body, because you need to get those off in order to get the valve body off. You don't need to take any of the hex head bolts out, just the ones with that fancy headed EP10 inverted Torx. So we'll do that. So here's the off-axis oil pump, and kind of built into the design of this pump, there's a little tab in there, and if you pry it out and lift it up, it allows you to slide the sprocket out. So the design of that sprocket, there's a little tab in there, and this bracket, if you will, kind of fits into a groove on that pump shaft. And then from the inside of the transmission, you pry that out and lift it up. And when you do that, it kind of pulls that bracket out of the pump groove and allows you to slide this back and out of the way and release it from the pump shaft, and then you can lift the valve body straight up. So that's the fancy design they got there. So we're going to go and take the rest of these out, these bolts out. I'm going to go ahead and take my spring off. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So we take those bolts out, we'll pull this valve body right off. Simple as that. They make life easy with these. The bolts are basically just 2 different lengths, and they're pretty good difference between each other, so you won't get those mixed up on where they go. To release the manual valve, you just pull the spring back and slide the manual valve link out of the manual valve. So now that I got the valve body out of the way, we're going to go ahead and push it off to the side. We're going to deal with this last, if you remember, and we're going to go through this. We're going to look at all the solenoids and the valves and figure out how it all works, but we're going to do that towards the end. Right now we're going to focus on this main unit with the clutches, the drums, and the gear sets, and we're going to go through that. So looking at the inside of this transmission right here, underneath the valve body, you can see this is where our pass-through harness comes in. Up here we have our speed sensor, our input shaft speed sensor. It's got an aluminum bolt that kind of holds it all in there. And it's got its own little dedicated harness that we'll take off here in a second. And we've got these air passages. This passage right here is our 23468, also known as our C4 clutch. And this passage right here is our 13567 passage, and that's also known as our C3 clutch. This one right here is our 45678R, which is also known as our C5 clutch. And this goes to the cooler, it comes back from the cooler. Underneath this bridge seal, we have our 1278R clutch, or our C1 clutch. And right here in this passage is our 12345R, or also known as our C2 clutch. We got a couple more speed sensors there towards the output. Our mode switch up here. So before we take it apart, we'll just go ahead and air test it real quick, see how it does. We're supposed to air test it with about 30 psi of air pressure. The first one we'll do here is our C4 clutch, which is the 23468. Can definitely hear it applying. The next one is our 13567, which is our C3 clutch. Ooh, sounds great. And now we're going to do the 45678R, also known as the C5 clutch. That sounds good. This one right here under the bridge seal, which I'll go ahead and take it out. That is our 1278R, or their C1. And we can actually watch it apply. And using like an air test plate, I can go through and check that C2 clutch, which is the 12345R. And we'll see how it seals. Everything seems to apply pretty well, so that is a good sign. I'm going to go ahead and take the speed sensors out and some of the rest of the electronics and the harnesses. Since I'm at this point, I'm going to go ahead and take this bracket that kind of locates the parking rod, because I'm going to end up having to take that off anyway to get some of these parts out, so I'm going to go ahead and do that now. In order to get the rooster come out with the switch, you have to pull that roll pin out, then drive this roll pin through or pull it out, depending on which direction you want to go. But then you can slide the shaft out and get this stuff out of the way. All right, I got this part of the case gutted. Now it's time to take the gear set out. So I have a tendency of calling this area like a front pump, but this is not a pump because the pump is built into the valve body. It's an off-axis design. So really this is like a front cover, and underneath this we'll find a front support that kind of keeps this gear set center lined. And so if I take all these 10mm headed bolts out and put a couple slide hammers in there, I could slide hammer this cover off. And we'll see this is where the sprocket, the drive sprocket and the chain live for the oil pump, and we can get that out of the way. Notice that all these bolts have a little bit of a sealer on it. So they don't want any of that ATF to kind of sneak its way around the threads and find its way into the bell housing. Ta-da! So as I said before, that this is just a cover to pretty much cover our chain and sprocket. And actually we found the issue with this transmission. It's got a broken gear right there. See, it snapped. And you can see it was, the torque converter was, where it drives the pump gear, was slipping on it. So there's no way this gear was spinning. So we found a problem with this one here. Next we have these 13mm support bolts that go around the outside. And before we pull that front support out, make sure you take that O-ring off for our torque converter off the input shaft. Otherwise that front bushing is going to grab on that when you try to pull it out. There's our front support. We got a couple sealing rings, little tongue and groove sealing rings here. And a little sleeve that's pushed in there, a Teflon seal, a front bushing. And then for that front pump gear, there is a thrust washer that's in there. We want to make sure, since this is a failure on this transmission, we want to pay close attention to this area on the support assembly to make sure it's all good and reusable. But yeah, it's a pretty simple setup here. So now we'll just start pulling some of these gear sets out. The 13567 is the first to come out. It's also our C3 clutch. We have Teflon sealing rings. We have a Torrington bearing and a thrust washer that goes underneath it. Next, we'll pull out a couple clutches, our 4, 5, 6, 7, 8R and our 2, 3, 4, 6, 8, which is our C4 and C5 clutch. All right. Now we get to pull apart our gear set, get some of these gear set parts out. GM's always been kind of weird with their naming, in my opinion, on their gears. This one right here is their direct and overdrive internal gear. And they like to use terms like reaction and input and overdrive, but this is obviously going to be our direct and overdrive carrier because that meshed together with it. Then we've got our input, and they call this an input internal gear, even though there's a sun gear and an internal gear kind of mixed together on it. Next, I'm going to pull out what they call their input carrier. And now we're at our next clutch and housing assembly, which is the 1278R or the C1 clutch. And I am going to just pull the snap ring out on it. There is actually a little bit of a spring tension behind it, which will probably cause this to move up about 1/8 of an inch, not that much. The service manual, I think, does show using the tool to compress it to get the snap ring out, but I've had it apart so I know it doesn't shoot up at you violently or anything like that. This is kind of a little bit of a different design. It has a aluminum apply ring, and in between the piston and the housing and the apply ring is a diaphragm spring. That's what causes it to pop up about 1/8 of an inch when you get that snap ring out. So that is the 1278R. So at this point I can pull my input sun gear out. This is what they like to call this, is their input sun gear. And reach down in there and grab my clutches. My 1278R clutches. These are the holding clutches that go between the case and this input sun gear assembly. And these got little hot spots on them. There's a little slippage. My guess is because they lost pump pressure, because the pump wasn't doing its thing and things started slipping. Surprisingly, a lot of these transmissions I've pulled out, the steels show hot spots, but the frictions actually don't look that bad. Reach way down in there and I can get some fingertip strength going. And my reaction internal gear. So now I need to take a snap ring out to get my last clutch out, which is the 12345R. And it comes out pretty easy. Don't have to deal with any spring tension. Snap ring. I can kind of grab the whole assembly, get it out. There's little hot spots on this one too. Got a wave plate at the bottom and only 3 frictions and 3 steels. Looking at this output gear set here, this is what they would call the reaction carrier assembly, and then this would be the output carrier. This is what the one speed sensor rode up against, and this is what the speed sensor that was in front of it rode up against. So those 2 rear speed sensors, one was for the output and the other one measured this reaction gear. Got my sun gear and the Torrington bearing that it rides on. An output shaft, it's kind of detached. And a Torrington bearing for it to ride on. So this 12345R piston that's in there actually comes out from the other side. So I'm going to spin this baby around. So I'm going to take these 15mm bolts out. and then pull this little housing off, and that's going to contain the piston for the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5R. And that's how you get to the 1, 2, 3, 4R apply piston, so we can go through and change its seals and go through and do the measurements that we need. Any measurements? And here's the gasket that goes along with it. So at this point, I have this case pretty much completely gutted, and I can go through and clean it and all that kind of stuff if I had to. And then what we're going to do is we're going to go through, pretty much build it back up from scratch. We're going to look at this gear set first, kind of try to get an understanding of how it works. And then we're going to start looking at the clutch by clutch, and build this thing back up from the bottom up. Pretty much the reverse of how we took it apart, but on the way back together with it, we're going to take it apart, each of these piston assemblies, look at what seals they use, see if there's anything unique to look at there, and then go through and put it together and measure the clutch pack clearances using the special procedure that they have for that, which is kind of unique, using some special tools. Now these tools I've had to make myself because we don't have those tools, and right now they're actually unavailable. You can't get them for months. And they're pretty expensive, but we have a lathe and a mill. So if you've got those two things, you could pretty much make any of the tools that you have here that you need for this transmission. So we'll go ahead and get started on that. First, I'm going to kind of clear off this bench so that way we can focus on just one thing at a time. So I got these parts scattered all over the bench here. And I guess to fully understand how this thing works, first we got to kind of look at what these individual parts are doing, what's the common connection, and how they're interacting with each other. And that's, of course, in addition to knowing the names. And the names, like I said, don't necessarily make perfect sense, but they are what they are. The easiest thing to look at here is the output. This is the output shaft assembly. In fact, this is specifically the output shaft. And GM likes to call this the output carrier. And then splined to that shaft, that's part of the output carrier, is the direct and overdrive carrier. So these are all parts that are always going to be output. So any of the torque leaving this transmission is going to come from this component right here. And as I mentioned before, this is the output shaft tone ring. So the speed sensor can read the speed of the output shaft, and this is the lug for the parking mechanism. So when we're in park, that's the big old lugs that they grab onto. Put it off to the side. Now some parts are simply reaction components, meaning they don't have a clutch that's holding onto them or driving them. They're just there to allow other gears to react off of them. And that's the case with this. This is the reaction carrier, and it ends up splining back here. That's the other tone ring that the kind of the second to last speed sensor will read. And so that'll fit over that component right there. And like I said, it's only there to react with. We don't have a clutch that can grab onto this, and we don't have a clutch that can drive that. Now all these other parts have specific connections to a clutch, or like in the case here with this input carrier, this is actually a part that's always driven. These lugs right here spline to that front clutch housing, and that's got the input shaft connected directly to it. So whenever there's input rotation, this input carrier automatically gets driven. So that's a part that's always going to be driven in this transmission. I guess starting in the back and moving forward, this reaction internal gear assembly, it receives that clutch assembly, a holding clutch. That's the 1, 2, 3, 5R, and it's going to grab onto this in first, second, third, fifth, and reverse, prevent it from spinning. It's going to be located right here. So next up is our input sun gear, and you can see it has a hub attached to it, and that's where the 1, 2, 7, 8R clutch grabs onto this. This is a holding clutch. So in first, second, seventh, and eighth, and reversed, when this clutch applies, that prevents both of these sun gears from rotating. So these are our two holding clutches that we've got right here. Simple as that. Next on this assembly is our input carrier. This input carrier is always driven by engine torque because it is directly driven through that front clutch housing and through the input shaft. So if there's front input shaft rotation, this front carrier rotates, this input carrier, through this shell assembly. It's a physical connection, it's always there, so no clutch needed to apply or release that. And this next part up is the input internal gear. And this input internal gear, you can see it's got internal gear on one side, sun gear on the other, and it has these lugs. And this is the 2, 3, 4, 6, 8 clutch is going to drive this part. And when that clutch is applied, it could do one of a couple things because it's located in this drum. It could connect this part to this part right here, the direct and overdrive internal gear assembly. Or if the 1, 3, 5, 6, 7 clutch is applied, the C3 clutch, it will allow input shaft rotation to be driving this component right here. So that's where the transmission gets a little high tech. They only have 5 clutches in this unit, but these 2 clutches up front, these 2 driving clutches, they're there to basically interconnect each other potentially to this drum. Continuing on, we've got our direct overdrive carrier assembly, and that direct overdrive carrier assembly is splined to the output shaft like I showed you earlier. This is a output gear component as well as that rear output carrier assembly. And lastly, we have our direct overdrive internal gear, and you can see there's a spline on it or a hub, if you will, to catch these clutch discs, the 4, 5, 6, 7, 8R C5 clutch. It's going to grab onto all that. And similar to this 2, 3, 4, 6, 8, it has the ability of applying to connect to this drum assembly to do depending on what the applications are, to either being driven by the input shaft or basically to connect a couple gears together to react amongst as a kind of a unit. So there's a lot going on in here. One part that I didn't put in yet is that output sun gear that goes all the way in the back, and it is driven by this shaft right there. Come on. And this is the gear set assembled. Now, it's a little weird to try to explain this because this shaft right here, which is built into this drum, it goes all the way through and connects to that rear sun gear. And at times when a clutch is applied, like when this clutch is applied, when the C3 clutch, the 1357R clutch is applied, it's going to actually drive that sun gear. That's going to be the input component. So to do power flow, it's kind of hard to do that because when I slide this on, it covers up a lot of stuff. So what I've done is I've taken another drum assembly and I pressed the shaft out so we can kind of go in there and we can at least grab onto that rear sun gear so we can kind of simulate some of these gear ratios. So thank you for watching this disassembly video. The next video you should watch is the reassembly video where I get into the gear set and the clutch components. Then after that, watch the valve body video where I tear down the valve body completely, explain what's going on in it, and then also explain some modifications that are done.